Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the first episode in a series on what I am calling sacred words. These are words or terms that can be found in the Bible, but also more generally are important to many of the religious traditions in the world. Some of you may know that in addition to being a linguist, I'm a scholar of religious studies, and specifically ancient Mediterranean religions is my focus. So words in the Bible are something that I particularly am interested in and study quite a bit. So I'm particularly enjoying this set of episodes. Let's dive in and first of all talk about the word that is sort of in our culture and in our English language and many other languages today is sort of an overarching term for what we are going to be talking about here. That word, of course, is religion. As I said, I'm a scholar of ancient Mediterranean religions and languages, and so perhaps it's appropriate that this term, like so many of the other terms that we are going to be looking at today, goes back to an ancient Mediterranean language that we talk about a lot on this channel because we get so many words from it in English. That, of course, is Latin, and our word religion goes back to a Latin word religio. In Latin, the G's were always hard, so a G sound, not a J sound. But the more important difference is that this word did not actually mean religion in the modern sense. The meaning of religio, and it was a pretty flexible word, but the basic meaning, the underlying fundamental meaning of the Latin word religio was a duty or an obligation. Oftentimes when this word was used in Roman, Republican, and imperial times, the word already had a connotation of duty or obligation to the gods. Of course, they were a polytheistic system, so it would have been gods and not just God for them. But the word did not necessarily only mean duty or obligation to the gods. If it did, then maybe it would kind of look like our modern word religion in the semantic sense. But we have to understand that in those times, this word did not just mean duty or obligation to the gods. It could easily, and often did mean duty or obligation to your fellow human beings or to the state or society or whatever. The etymology of this word is pretty clear. Lig is a root that means to tie. It's actually an obligation. An obligation is something that is tying you to do something or binding you to a particular course of action. We also have the word ligament, which of course is a part of your body that connects two things together. It ties them together. So that's what the lig means. The re at the beginning is one of these Latin prefixes that we have talked quite a bit about that simply means back. So a religio is something that holds you back from maybe just doing whatever you want. It's a duty. It's an obligation. It's something that you need to do, whether you want to do it or not. It's something that society says that you should do. Again, oftentimes in those days, this was used to mean some kind of obligation to the gods, what we today might call a religious obligation, but it was a much more general term than that. So this is where we get the modern word religion from, but if this word didn't mean religion in anything like the modern sense, although you can probably see how it might have evolved in that direction, especially as the sense of duties to the gods slowly took over throughout the centuries. So if this word was not the ancient Latin word for religion, then what was the ancient Latin or Roman word for religion? You might be surprised to learn that there really wasn't an ancient Latin or Roman word for religion. The word obviously developed from that Latin word in the medieval period and really on into the modern European period in the past 500 years, but the semantics seem to be a new development. As far as we know, interestingly, in the history of all of the world's cultures, ancient Mediterranean cultures did not have a word at all, as far as we can tell from their texts, that corresponds to the modern concept of religion. It seems to have been something that the modern concept seems to have been something that evolved very specifically in the context of European, medieval and modern European politics and culture, and yes, religion, as all of those things kind of mixed together in the past 1,000 to 1,500 years. This is also the case for modern cultures, where many modern cultures from all over the world, other than Europe, didn't really have a word that corresponds to the word religion until they came into contact with modern European cultures, as those European cultures sailed around the globe, visited various places, as you know, colonized various places, and took this concept of religion with them. Most countries, most cultures, most languages didn't really have this concept and didn't really have a word for it. So you might be wondering, how is this possible? Isn't it the case, just as we know from a historical or anthropological perspective, that religion has been almost a human universal since time immemorial, certainly, back to prehistoric times. So how is it that people apparently just didn't have this word and didn't seem to have this concept, at least in the modern European sense? I think the answer is that the vast majority of cultures that have ever existed haven't felt the need to divide what we today call religion from everything else. If you think about it, we need a word for religion in modern European, Western, whatever you want to call it, society. Obviously, those terms aren't exactly interchangeable. Whatever you want to call our society today, we need a word for this thing that we call religion, because we have innovated this idea that it's something that can be separated out from and even cut off from everything else that is going on in our culture and in our society. And once you do that, you need a word for that thing once you cut it off or cut it out or separate it. But the vast majority of cultures that have ever existed, certainly including ancient Mediterranean cultures, didn't separate these things from the rest of their existence and the rest of their culture. Certainly the Romans, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hebrews or Jews or Israelites, for them, what we would call their religion was completely intertwined with everything else. It was completely intertwined with their politics and with their culture. And so it would have been unthinkable to them to try to separate the things that have something to do with the gods and the worship of the gods and everything that goes into our modern word religion out from everything else. And so since they didn't separate it, they didn't really have a word for it. It was just everywhere. It was just part of the air they breathed in their culture. And I think that's the best explanation as to why most of the cultures of the world did not innovate this particular term for religion. It was just their culture. They didn't need a word because their culture was their religion, and their religion was their culture. And so when they wanted to talk about the way that different cultures or different groups of people or ethnicities, as we would call them today, did things differently, they actually usually used words like ethnicity, or clan or something like that when they were talking about what particular groups of people would do, how they would worship the gods or God differently depending on their particular ethnicity that they belonged to. They usually used ethnic terminology to try to describe this rather than something special like religion. They would say, well, that ethnicity does things in a particular way, but they didn't really have a specific word for religion. If you've ever read the Bible a lot, you may have noticed this, and if not, you're going to notice it now, that the word religion almost never occurs in the Bible, which might strike you as a little bit odd because ostensibly, as most people would say today, it's a book that is all about religion. So why does it almost never use the word religion? This is your answer right here. The languages that it was written in, Biblical Hebrew and ancient Greek for the most part, a smattering of Aramaic, these languages didn't have that term. They didn't have that concept. So even though they're constantly talking about what we would today call religion, they never talk about what we would today call religion, at least the word or the concept, because that's not the way that they divided up the world. That's not the way that they thought about the world. There are a handful of places in many Bible translations today that will use the word religion, and I'm just going to tell you that's not a good translation of those particular words. I'm not going to get into the weeds of what those words are, but they don't really mean religion in the modern sense of the word. They're Greek and Hebrew words that mean something else. Let's put it that way. But in general, religion was not a concept. Certainly the modern idea was not really there. The worship of the gods was just part of everything they did. So that's a good segue to the next word, which of course is God. They definitely had words for God because this was something that was very important to them. They fervently believed in gods. Most cultures, as you probably knew, were polytheistic, and so they believed in multiple gods, but there were occasional cultures like the ancient Israelites and the Egyptians from time to time when there was a reforming pharaoh, for instance, who were monotheistic or at least henotheistic, which the latter term means they may have believed in the existence of multiple gods, but they only worshipped one. So these cultures definitely did not have a linguistic gap when it came to terms for God. But let's talk about our word God in English first and where that word comes from. This is not a borrowing. We did not get this word from Latin or Greek or Hebrew or anywhere else. This comes from our linguistically Germanic past in English. And it goes all the way back to Proto-Germanic, because the other Germanic languages, like German, like Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages have cognates for this word as well. So we can pretty easily trace it back to a Proto-Germanic word, Guthan. And if you undo Grimm's law from Guthan, you get something like gout or gut. So we're pretty sure that that's the Proto-Indo-European formulation that Proto-Germanic Guthan would have come from. The interesting thing is that there are a couple of different Proto-Indo-European roots that Proto-Germanic Guthan could have come from. We're pretty sure that the T at the end is that past participle ending that shows up in Latin and other places that we've been talking about elsewhere on this channel. So the root would have been gao or gu or something like that. Those are two different roots that mean two different things, however. Gao means to call upon or to invoke. And so if you make it a past participle with that T suffix on the end in Proto-Indo-European, this word Guthan in Proto-Germanic would have come from something that meant somebody you call upon, somebody you pray to, somebody you ask for stuff. You can imagine how a word like that might have come to mean a word like God in Germanic. Of course, as you know, Proto-Germanic speakers were not Christian. They were polytheistic. They were worshiping something closer to the Norse gods, most likely. So they would have been a polytheistic system, but they certainly believed in gods and would have needed a word for it. The other possibility for the etymology of God is this other root that means to pour out, gu, which gives us words in Greek and Sanskrit and elsewhere in the Indo-European languages. In many ancient religions, one of the ways that you would give some kind of offering to a particular deity would be to pour a libation. You would take some valuable and often tasty liquid like wine or olive oil or sometimes milk, sometimes just water, and you would pour it out into the ground. This would be a common way to try to give offerings to spirits of ancestors. You might pour something out by their tomb, or to underworld deities who were thought to literally live under the ground. So if you wanted to offer them something, you had to pour it into the ground. If this etymology is correct, it suggests that the original meaning of this particular word God in Proto-Germanic might not have been heavenly deities, because you wouldn't normally pour out an offering to heavenly deities, although there are exceptions, but normally not. If you think about it, it doesn't necessarily make sense. The word God, if that etymology is correct, might have originally meant a lesser spirit of some kind, maybe even the spirits of deceased ancestors, which is a concept that many cultures, probably most cultures throughout the history of humanity have had, that deceased ancestors are still around, they're still paying attention, and they want to be remembered, and they want to be given things like offerings of some kind. It does seem interesting that in earlier Germanic languages, this is not the word for the big gods like Thor or Odin. They wouldn't be called gods. There was another root in Proto-Germanic that would be used for them, and God may have originally been used for lesser spiritual beings of some kind. Nonetheless, when the Germanic tribes were introduced to Christianity and the Bible was translated into the Germanic languages, this is the word that was chosen to be to translate the Latin and Greek words for God, what we would call the monotheistic God today. And so if this word used to not necessarily refer to the highest level of gods in the older polytheistic system, it got a promotion at that time. And this is why we, think of this as the ultimate power in the universe in a monotheistic system. What word or words would this have been translating from Latin and Greek? The Latin word for God was deus, and this was the word that would have been used both for the polytheistic gods like Jupiter or Juno, for instance, and the Judeo-Christian gods. So they didn't have that issue that the Germanic tribes seem to have had, where maybe there were different words that were being used. This Latin word deus comes from the Proto-Indo-European root deo, which we have actually talked about on a previous episode, so I'll link that here. The Proto-Indo-European root deo means to shine, and as a noun, it can mean the shiny place, which would have been the sky, because of course the sun and the moon and the stars are up there. And so if you build a noun to that, a particular individual, it basically just means someone who lives in the sky, or who is associated with the sky, or maybe who is just shiny in some way. And so you can kind of see how this would have been a good word for some kind of divine beings that live up there in the sky, or are associated with the heavens, or are shiny in some way, or all of the above. The Greek word for God, even though it really looks like it should be cognate with the Latin word for God, actually is not. That Greek word is theos, and of course we get a number of words like theology or atheism from this Greek word that means God. This actually probably comes from the Proto-Indo-European root day, which we were just talking about a few episodes ago. So I'll link to that episode as well. And that root means to set up, or to place, or ultimately to do or to make. And so if that's the etymology of theos, this would mean like the individual who does things, or who makes things. In the older polytheistic system, the gods were not necessarily the creators or the makers of the cosmos. So that would make more sense in a Judeo-Christian sense of the monotheistic God creating the heavens and the earth. That's not necessarily how ancient Greek polytheists thought of their gods, but nonetheless, it makes sense as a term for a particular individual who is able to do things that you can't, or make things happen that you can't. Again, with both deus and theos, these would have been terms that would have usually been in the plural, and usually were in the plural for ancient Latin and Greek speakers in their polytheistic system. But Greek philosophers oftentimes refer to theos as this sort of philosophical God who is maybe above the other ones. And so while they were not monotheistic in the Judeo-Christian sense, they were open to the possibility of there being one God on top who was kind of the reigning God, and maybe, depending on your particular philosophical beliefs, could have been the creator of some part, or maybe all part, of what we see. Let's go back to Hebrew. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, was written in biblical Hebrew. And so when the biblical texts were translated from Hebrew into Greek and then Latin, we need to keep going back to see what was being translated here. There are the names of God in Hebrew are particularly complicated, but the most basic word for God in biblical Hebrew was El. That was the singular, and the plural was Elohim. Notice that I have punted on the question of whether to capitalize that, because there was no capitalization in ancient texts of any language. So this is a modern concern. This wouldn't have been an ancient concern as to whether to capitalize it. But of course, today, the capitalization implies that we are talking about one particular individual. And as we're going to see, this is going to be context dependent in the Hebrew Bible. Elohim was a very common name for God. This was not his proper name per se, but it was a very common name for God in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. El, technically the singular version, often shows up in compounds that name God, such as the very frequent compound El Shaddai, that is especially common in the books of Genesis and early on in Exodus in the patriarchal stories. So you can get El, you can get Elohim. However, even in the Bible, these words didn't necessarily exclusively refer to the monotheistic God. They could also refer to other individuals. So we see that Elohim can also be used in the Bible to denote some kind of spiritual being that is not the monotheistic God, and maybe not even what we would call a God at all. It's just some kind of spirit of some kind. A very good example of this is in 1 Samuel 28, which is the famous story of King Saul of Israel going to visit a medium, who is often termed the Witch of Endor today. And so he asks this medium to call up the spirit of the recently deceased prophet Samuel. And she does so, and he asks her what she is seeing, and she says, "I see Elohim arising from the earth." Now, notice I have not capitalized that here, because I'm pretty sure she didn't mean God. I don't think she meant I'm looking at the spirit of God arising from the earth. This seems to be a use of Elohim that is not something we would probably capitalize, because she's just saying, I see a spirit. And does she mean it in the plural? That's actually up for debate, whether we should translate this spirit or spirits here, but we're really getting into the weeds of Bible translation. So let's just stick with what she is saying here. She's saying some kind of spirit is arising from the earth. If you know the story, it turns out to be the spirit, or maybe we would today call it ghost, of the dead prophet Samuel, who then comes up and offers some rather discouraging advice to King Saul, and then goes back to his home, apparently underneath the earth. Again, I'd simply bring this up to show you that this term did not necessarily just mean God in biblical Hebrew. We see it other places where it clearly doesn't mean just the monotheistic God either. And it didn't necessarily have to just mean anything from Israelite culture. The cultures around the Israelites were polytheistic. These were Canaanite peoples such as the Phoenicians and other groups. We know some things about Phoenician religion and Phoenician mythology based on some texts that they have left us. And we know that in their culture, El was also the name of their chief god. He was often depicted as an old dude, essentially, who sort of was at the top of the pantheon and had a family, but oftentimes he would let his family do a lot of the busy work that had something to do with reigning over the world and the cosmos. So El is already there in the stories of the cultures that were surrounding Israel. So when the Israelites talked to their neighbors, the Canaanites, they were both able to agree that El was the chief god, even if they disagreed about some other things, such as whether there were other gods, and if so, who they were. Was Baal a god, for instance? This was likely to be something that would be hotly debated between, say, the Phoenicians and the Israelites, but they were able to agree on the fact that there was a god named El who was very highly placed in the pecking order of the divine sphere. Let's talk about the word spirit, because of course this is also important with everything that we have been talking about. Where does the word spirit come from? The word spirit actually just comes straight from a Latin word spiritus, which did mean spirit, but it could also mean breath. It's something invisible that moves. So take your hand and blow on it. That's spirit. That's spirit for the ancient Romans, and they would use this word to mean breath or spirit. It comes straight from the verb spiro, which just meant to breathe, so it kind of makes sense that this could mean breath as a noun. We get a number of words in English today from various Latin compounds of this verb spiro. So for instance, to respire, of course the noun is respiration. To respire is to breathe again, because re can mean again. So you respire, you keep breathing. That's a good thing. What's maybe not so good thing is if you breathe out for the last time and then you don't breathe in again. That's to expire. Ex means out, and so to expire means to breathe out and to stop breathing, and then you die, right? We use this word a lot to mean, things metaphorically dying, like if your milk in your refrigerator is past its expiration date, you probably shouldn't drink it. Inspire, this one is interesting. Of course, in means in, so the literal meaning of inspiration is a breathing into. In ancient Mediterranean religions, this was not metaphorical, but this was actually literal. People believed that when you felt, the light bulb go on in your head for something, whether you're writing a book or composing a poem or a piece of music or whatever you're doing, anything that's kind of artsy or just having an idea, they believed that what we would today call spiritual force was actually breathing that idea into you. And that's the literal meaning of inspiration, to have some outside spiritual force, God, spirit, whatever, breathing that idea into you. So that's very literal for them, the idea of inspiration. Aspire comes from ad, which means to or toward. We had a couple of episodes on this earlier on the channel. So if you aspire, which then got simplified to aspire, you breathe toward, literally. What does it mean to breathe toward? It means that you're putting your hopes and dreams and desires toward a particular thing. That's what it means to have an aspiration. And then perspire, perhaps this is the most interesting one. Per in Latin means through, so to perspire means to breathe through. We use this meaning your skin is breathing through its pores and sweating, of course. That's how we use this today, but that's what perspiration is. You are breathing through your skin and sweating and trying to cool yourself off. All of this comes from spiro, and it's ultimately connected to this Latin word spiritus, which is where we get the word spirit. But I went through this kind of just to show you how flexible this word meant. It was not an inherently religious word for them. Again, they wouldn't have necessarily known what the word religious meant, because their religion was sort of wound up into everything else that they did. It was wound up into their very breathing, as you can see from the terms that they would use for it. So also in Greek, the Greek word for spirit was pneuma, and the Romans would use spiritus to translate pneuma and vice versa. This one also meant breath. And not surprisingly was connected to the organs that you use for breathing, which are your lungs, right? That's the word we use in our language. And so it's not surprising that we get words like pneumonia from the Greek word for lungs, because it's the disease of the lungs. It kind of makes sense. Interestingly, pneuma could mean any air in motion, including the wind. So when the wind blows, that's the breath of the gods. That's the breath of divine beings. And it's also spirit. So you can see how the natural world and what we would call the spiritual world were very closely connected for them. They didn't necessarily believe in the world of the supernatural. They mostly thought that their gods and their spirits lived in this plane of existence. And so when you felt the wind and when you were breathing, you were experiencing the gods. You didn't have to prove them any further. You're feeling it all the time. You're breathing it in. That is the breath that the gods have given you and are going to take back someday. Back to what we were talking about here, pneumatics is a scientific field that is the study of the properties and movement of gases. Anything air, obviously air is a gas, and so that comes from this ancient word as well. The Hebrew for spirit was a particular word, ruach. And again, when the Greeks were translating the Hebrew scriptures, they would usually translate ruach with pneuma, and the Romans would translate it with spiritu. So all these words go together, although they're not etymologically connected. This Hebrew word also meant breath or wind, just like pneuma. So again, this is something that the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean generally agreed upon, that wind, breath, spirit all kind of used the same word because they were all fundamentally connected in some kind of deep way. You can see this in the second verse of the Bible. Some of you may know the first verse of the Bible, which is often translated, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But then the second verse goes on to say, the ruach of Elohim was hovering over the face of the waters. Usually this is translated in English to say the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and that's a perfectly fine translation. But as is so often the case when we are trying to translate Hebrew, there's multiple meanings there that you really have to be able to read Hebrew to see the different meanings. And this is already a great example in the second verse of the Bible. What does ruach really mean here? Is it the Spirit of God? Is it the breath of God? Is he blowing on the face of the waters? Or is it the wind of God? Is he sending a wind? For an ancient speaker of Hebrew, the answer to that question would have been, it's all three of those things. Spirit, breath, wind, all at once. And so when we have to choose one of those words in English, we kind of limit the scope in an artificial way of what the original Hebrew is actually trying to tell us there. That's a linguistic problem. That's a cultural gap where our cultures see things differently than theirs do. And so we also have to talk about them somewhat differently. And we definitely lose something there in that process of not just linguistic translation, but also cultural translation. All right, we're going to stop there. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll dive into a lot more of these words. See you then.